Today I'm going to show you how to make a basic high hydration loaf of sourdough bread. The higher water content gives this bread a soft, creamy, almost custardy interior. The flavor of this bread is mildly tangy, and the process for making it is very straightforward. Start by taking 25 grams of leftover sourdough starter out of the fridge, feed it 50 grams of bread flour and 50 grams of water, then let it sit out at room temperature overnight for about 6 to 8 hours until it doubles in size. Then you can mix it into your dough. For this 80% hydration dough, start by adding 350 grams of water, and then get out your active and risen sourdough starter and add 100 grams of that sourdough starter right into the water. Then add 10 grams of salt, and yes, you can add the salt directly to the starter and water. It doesn't kill the starter. I've never had a problem with that. Before you add the flour, go ahead and mix up the starter with a spoon. You just want to dissolve the starter and the salt into the water a little bit before you add the flour. Then add your fourth and final ingredient, 450 grams of plain white bread flour. I like to use the blue bag of King Arthur brand bread flour, but any similar flour should work fine as well. Now mix the dough together with a spoon, just bringing those ingredients together until they form a cohesive dough. Should just take 1 or 2 minutes of mixing. Since the dough has more water in it than other recipes, it should actually mix together fairly easily. Once your dough looks something like this and it's holding together, it's time to cover it up. So cover your dough up with a kitchen towel and let it rest at room temperature for 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, your dough should hold together a lot better than before, and it should be ready for your first set of stretches and folds. Stretching and folding is an alternative to kneading, and it's better for these high hydration doughs that are a little bit stickier. For this recipe, we'll be doing just 3 stretches and folds with a half-hour rest in between each one. So to start, grab an edge of the dough, stretch it up as you just saw me do, and fold it over the top of the dough, then give the dough a quarter turn, stretch the next edge of the dough up in the air, and fold it over the top. Another quarter turn, stretch the third edge of the dough up into the air, and fold it over the top of the dough, quarter turn, and stretch the last corner of the dough up, and fold it over the top. There you go, that was 1 set of stretches and folds, so go ahead and cover your dough up with the kitchen towel again, let it rest for 30 minutes. A half hour later, uncover the dough and you'll do the second set of stretches and folds. This will be exactly the same as the first set of stretch and folds, but the dough should feel a lot stronger and like it's holding together better, because over time the gluten network is going to be stronger and stronger, making for a better, chewier bread. So once you stretch and fold each of the 4 corners of the dough, go ahead and cover up your dough again with the kitchen towel and let it rest for a half hour one last time. Then 30 minutes later, uncover the dough and perform your third and final set of stretch and folds. And your dough at this point should feel very strong, and it should be holding together well and not tearing. After stretching and folding each of the 4 corners of the dough again, you are now done with stretching and folding. Go ahead and flip your dough over so the smooth side is facing up. And now you're ready for the first rise or the bulk fermentation. You can do this in a different bowl, or you can cover the dough up with a damp kitchen towel, which is what I'm doing here. Place it on your kitchen countertop and let it rise for 4 to 6 hours at room temperature until it roughly doubles in size. 5 hours later, my dough had doubled in size and it was ready to shape. In fact, due to the 100+ degree weather here in Arizona, my dough got a little bit too risen and puffy. It was more than doubled in size and I should have shaped it sooner, but it'll still taste great, and I'll show you how I attempt to compensate for the overproofed dough during the scoring process later. For now, take your dough that is doubled in size, hopefully just doubled in size, and put it onto your kitchen counter, no flour necessary. Gently pre-shape it into a ball by going around the dough a few times like this, popping any excessive air bubbles if you have any, and let your dough sit uncovered at room temperature to rest for 30 minutes. Then 30 minutes later, get out a Banneton basket. I've got this 10-inch oval Banneton basket that I've dusted with bread flour. Then dust the top of your dough with some bread flour as well to make a non-stick barrier. Then flip your dough over so that the sticky side is now facing up, and I'll show you a really simple way to shape your round dough into an oval. Simply fold it in half like a book, and then press the seam closed a little bit. Then turn your dough 90 degrees and give it another fold. Just close it like a book again, and then pinch the seam closed so that everything sticks together. There you have a nice oval-shaped dough that can fit in your Banneton basket. Gently place it into the Banneton basket with the seam side up, and then pinch the seam closed if it's starting to open up again, and your dough is ready for the final proof or the second rise. You could let your dough proof at room temperature for 1.5 to 2 hours and then bake it, but I'm going to show you how to use your fridge to cold proof your dough to build some extra flavor. First, cover your dough up with a kitchen towel and let it rise for 1 hour at room temperature to get some extra fermentation before it goes into the fridge. My dough is really puffing up fast in this heat, so it's definitely time to move it to the fridge now. Cover your dough up with a kitchen towel or some kind of liner for your Banneton basket, and then move the dough to your cold refrigerator where the dough can proof overnight in the cold environment and build up some extra flavor. Anywhere between 8 to 12 hours in the fridge should be fine. The next day, about 30 minutes before you're ready to bake, preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit with your Dutch oven inside. Then once your oven is fully preheated, take your dough out of the fridge and it's time to bake. To score your dough, get out a piece of parchment paper that's just a little bit bigger than your dough and flip the dough out of its Banneton basket and onto the piece of parchment paper. At this point, I can tell that my dough is definitely a little bit overproofed and overinflated, so I'm going to be scoring it very gently so that it doesn't completely deflate in the oven. Brush off the excess flour from the top of your dough and then gently score the top of the dough in one long slash with the razor blade. I'm being pretty careful here to only score a very shallow cut in the top of my dough because my dough is a little bit overproofed, but if your dough isn't overproofed, you can score more deeply. Pick your dough up, parchment paper and all, and transfer it into your hot preheated Dutch oven. Close the Dutch oven lid to trap the steam and then bake at 450 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, remove the Dutch oven lid to release the steam and admire your oven spring. My dough's looking kind of funky today because it overproofed, deflated a little bit in one spot, so hopefully your dough is looking better than mine. Either way, put it back in the oven and keep baking for another 15 to 20 minutes with the lid off. After another 20 minutes of baking, for a total of 40 minutes of total baking time, my bread was a dark golden brown color and ready to remove from the oven. Transfer your bread onto a wire rack or other cooling rack and let it cool for at least 1 hour before you slice it and serve it. Once cooled, I was ready to slice into this bread and start the taste test. Even though the bread was a little bit deflated on top because of it being overproofed, I was really happy with the texture and structure on the inside of this high hydration sourdough bread. There weren't any crazy big holes or anything like that, but the inside had a really nice lacy crumb and it was just very well fermented, soft and fluffy. Compared to my regular sourdough bread recipe, which is 70% hydration, this 80% hydration sourdough bread felt softer on the inside and a little bit moister in a good way. It felt like the bread was retaining a little bit more moisture than my standard sourdough bread recipe does, even after baking. It felt softer, creamier, and a little bit more custardy, and the flavor matched that. It had a light and creamy texture with a very mildly tangy flavor. This bread tastes great on its own, but of course I have to toast up a slice and add some butter or jam. I tried this with butter and blueberry jam, as well as butter and honey. It was great both ways, but the bread was great on its own as well. This is just one of the recipes in my 52 Weeks of Sourdough series. I'm more than halfway through, and you can find all those recipes on my website. I'll see you in the next video.